Yeah, people ask me about leadership, and I say this in the book too. Leadership and being in charge and being a leader are two different things. One's a noun and one's a verb, right? Leadership's a behavior. Being in charge is a noun. And we also don't get to call ourselves leaders, right? Because it's not you can't self-designate. It's not calling yourself good looking.
You can't give yourself a call sign, right?
That's right. Yeah, you can't give yourself.
I'm an excellent lover, and then my wife's like, no, I actually get to vote on that one. No.
That's right.
You're mediocre at best.
Same with leadership. We know this, right? We don't, just because someone's quote in charge doesn't necessarily mean we think of them as a leader. It's all about our behaviors, and so we. Even in the SEAL teams, it can be the OEC, it can be the chief, but then there's that E5 over there who you would go to every single day and twice on Sunday, because that's the guy who leads. That's the guy who helps. That's the guy who has your back. That's the guy who behaves in a way that says, I follow you. So,
Hey, Jonathan Cleck with another episode of the Shots from the Winchester podcast. Today we have on Rich Diviney. Rich is the author of The Attributes. You can find him at theattributes.com. Rich is a retired Navy SEAL commander. You can see all of my my markings on here in this book because it's that good. I actually keep markings on here just so I can go back and reference it, because it is a really, really good book for anybody who's leading a team. I don't care if you're leading your kid's sports team, you're trying to lead the team, you're a busy mom at home trying to lead your team of teenagers just to get them on the bus in the morning, or if you're trying to lead the next Fortune 100 company. It's a super book, and Rich is a really good guy, really insightful, combines a lot of just of experience and experiential learning from his time, 20 years plus in the SEAL teams, with some hard science, and he brings the science that backs it up. Super engaging conversation. Stick around. I think you're really going to learn some stuff from this one.
This individuality stuff is a bunch of crap.
There's a reason why.
A master of innovation.
The key to this growing is you.
Any rational person would give up.
I can't disagree with that.
Make sure that we're not prisoners of our own experiences.
You need a team of great people.
Will not tolerate a loser.
What they need is a common vision.
Helping organizations win one veteran at a time. This is the Greencastle podcast.
All right, Rich, thanks for joining us today, man. We know you're busy, especially with the release of the book. I'll go right into it. Something that jumped out at me right out of the gate. There's a Simon Sinek video that's out there where he talks about, he's like, I worked with the Navy SEALs, and he uses this performance and trust. And I've always wondered, I'm like, I wonder where he got that. And because he talks about, the selection at specialized commands, how they performance and trust, and he does his graph. I know you've worked closely with Simon. Did he get that from you?
He did.
Did he really?
I was.
You found the source.
You found the source. He asked me when he was writing the book. He said, "Hey, I'm one of the chapters will be about teams, and I want to talk about this and use this." I remember showing it to him when I first met him. I think I talked to him about it. I was running training at the Specialized Command. I had just been out to visit Buds, the command, and I can't remember who was in charge at the time. But anyway, I remember sitting down with it'll come to me as we're talking, but sitting down with the CO, who was also a friend, obviously a little bit more senior, but he said, "Hey, we're looking at this graph. This is how we kind of see this, this work." And I said, and both of us thought it was cool because it made that distinction between performance and trust. And of course, trust is about behavior. It's not about, skill. And now certainly there's trust in someone's competency of skill, but that doesn't. I mean, Buds is not about a competency course. It's about, which is funny. It's called training, but it's not really training at all. It's really assessment and selection. We do some training, sure, but it's mostly assessment and selection. So I think it allowed a distinction between trust and performance that's important, and it continues to be important today because we're seeing all the controversy and all the work that needs to be done inside the teams, because some of that process has broken down over the years, and we're seeing that play out in some negative ways. So
yeah, and I'm assuming you're talking about the pretty radical transformation that's going on right now, where the teams hit the reset button and said, hey, we've had a pretty good denigration in our either how we look at leaders, how we promote them, or what we qualify as leadership. And I know there was they brought together a bunch of the senior enlisted and the senior officers together to say, hey guys, what are we doing? What are we doing wrong? And have a real honest, hard look at themselves. And that's actually something you talk about in the book, is that introspection. Is if you were a fly on the wall in that conversation where the SEAL teams, which are arguably a pretty high performing organization, what would you want to hear? And it's kind of $1 million question, right? But what would you want to hear them say in there when they're saying, "Hey, we're messed up and we need to have that hard look at ourselves"?
Wow, that's both a tough question and has the potential of being a controversial one, because I think I think that every organization needs to look at what I call elemental behavior. This is what I love about. This is why I dove into the attributes in the first place. I'm interested in elemental behavior. What is the elemental human? In other words, where are the sources of behavior? And this is what Buds. I think Buds is it's one of the purest selection. It's one of the purest selection processes on the planet, and that's what I loved about it. I don't know if I loved it during it, but I certainly loved after it. Was that
it's always that recollection of like, oh, that wasn't so bad.
Yeah, well, yeah, and the three of us can anybody who goes through can relate to this, right? Because we all think of ourselves as average dudes, and yet we went to this thing. And as soon as I remember that the work it took for me and all of us to get there in the first place. And that was, whether it was Academy or ROTC like I was, it was interview processes, it was tests, and you had to be selected. And it was always up to someone else whether or not you'd get there. I mean, certainly up to you and how you presented, but ultimately the choice was, hey, a bunch of people are decide if you have what it takes, and they'll get you there. As soon as we stepped on those beaches of Coronado, all of that external shit dropped away. It was all on us. And that, I remember feeling like as soon as I recognized that, I almost felt comfortable, because I was like, okay, this is all on me. I mean, no one else has a say. Didn't matter where I was from, didn't matter how athletic I was, didn't matter what my grades were, didn't matter what color my skin, none of that mattered. All it mattered was, are you going to be able to do what we ask you to do? And I think that's the elemental us. And I think the community has a real challenge in being introspective, but also being introspective in the right way. It's the usual mantra is that it's a leadership failure. It's a failure in leadership, and that's correct. I don't disagree with that. But the teams are really interesting and distinct in that the leaders aren't necessarily the officers, right? I mean,
you're right.
We are and we aren't, right? We're in charge, and it can be, but there's an enlisted element of the teams that's dominant in there. And that's where the culture forms, and that's where the culture comes from. And I think the officers certainly need to be cognizant of that and be influential in that. But in my opinion, the problem's not going to be solved by the officers. The problem's going to be solved by the enlisted. And that's where I think, if I were to fly on the wall, that's where I'd sound the warning bells. If the conversation was steered more towards the officer leadership than it was the enlisted leadership and the cultures that are created in that zone. It's an interesting problem.
It's almost like formal versus informal leaders, right? The enlisted, they do have formal leadership as you get more senior, but you're right, that culture, that what is acceptable, what's not acceptable is a function of, the chief or the LPO saying, hey, knucklehead, stop that.
Yeah.
Or looking and seeing somebody doing something and be like, okay.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what they got to be careful of.
And I gotta say and I say this actually, people ask me about leadership, and I say this in the book too. Leadership and being in charge and being a leader are two different things. One's a noun and one's a verb, right? Leadership's a behavior. Being in charge is a noun. And we also don't get to call ourselves leaders, right? Because it's not you can't self-designate. It's not calling yourself good looking.
You can't give yourself a call sign, right?
That's right. Yeah, you can't give yourself.
I'm an excellent lover, and then my wife's like, no, I actually get to vote on that one. No.
That's right.
You're mediocre at best.
Same with leadership. We know this, right? We don't, just because someone's quote in charge doesn't necessarily mean we think of them as a leader. It's all about our behaviors, and so even in the SEAL teams, it can be the OEC, it can be the chief, but then there's that E5 over there who you would go to every single day and twice on Sunday, because that's the guy who leads, that's the guy who helps, that's the guy who has your back, that's the guy who behaves in a way that says, I follow you. So the question becomes, I think, for the teams, and this is the problem that the teams face today, that the three of us and even the senior leadership, who are all of our peers, didn't face when we went through training, was that the pop culture aspect of the SEAL teams is now part of the culture. And the reason is, people say this to me all the time. It's like, hey, how's the culture changed? It's like, well, I can't tell you that for certain, but I will tell you this. when I went through, which was in mid-90s, when we went through, like I would look at like remember that Spike Lee commercial where it had for the Navy SEALs, and it just showed the waves crashing on the beach, and then it went black, and then it showed the footprints in the sand, and then the waves came and washed away the footprints, and it just said U.S. Navy SEALs, right?
Yeah.
I remember seeing that. I was like, that's what I want to be. I want to be invisible. I want to be an invisible badass. That's me, right? That's why a lot of us joined, because not many people knew what the SEALs were back then. We were like, ooh, this is cool. It's kind of unknown. It's invisible. It's like shadowy. Okay, and that's cool. Then 9/11 happens, okay? And now the reasons for joining change, right? The guys who are joining now are like, okay, 9/11 happened. I want to get out there. I want to fight for my country. I want to get my jihad on, whatever that is. And I'm not judging anything. It's just the reasons shifted, okay? Then the SEALs start to become famous, all right?
Yeah.
You have, and it's through some tragedy like Red Wings, and through some triumph like Neptune Spear, and through other tragedy like extortion, right? But now the SEALs are the most famous unit on the planet. Well, now guys map that onto the youth, right? Now the guys are saying, okay, I want to be, and add to that an underlying generational trend that we've all seen, and I've seen in our kids and my nephews and nieces, of this idea that kids seem to be anchored towards fame, right? They want to be known, right? Whether it's a YouTube thing, but
they want to be recognized. They want to be an influencer, whatever it might be.
Totally. Well, add that into the mix. Now you have a dude who's type A, high testosterone, really like hey, I want to get out of action oriented, wants to serve their country, wants to do something cool, wants to say kind of be spec ops, but also in the back of their minds, this fame thing is also in there. Well, what's the most famous spec ops team? Of course I want to be a Navy SEAL. I would too if I were a kid today, right? But we can't deny the reasons are different, right? So when people join for those reasons, they're joining with this idea of a mythos, of a mythology that oftentimes when they get into the reality doesn't necessarily match up, right? Yeah. And when people try to then force it to match up, that's when we have issues, right? So I think this is all part of the problem.
It's an interesting, and it's a good segue, because one of the things you talk about in the book is narcissism, and you acknowledge, hey, we all have it, and then you go into like the dopamine drop that happens when we get our first 100 likes, and how we feed off of that. So when you are, and it's not just about the SEAL teams, right? I mean, that's the breadth of a lot of our experiences here, the three of us. But for other folks listening, they go, okay, I'm not in a SEAL team, but I am in an organization that struggles with maybe a younger generation that has a sense of entitlement, or that's what they're looking for. They're looking for that dopamine rush. How does an organization, how do they screen for, or can you screen for that being the motivation for somebody wanting a position or wanting to be a manager because they want that dopamine, because it's a narcissistic thing? How do you promote, or how do you identify the right reason people should be put in positional leadership spots?
Yeah, man, I think it's a great question. My initial response is that we don't ignore it. We acknowledge it. Every one of us, regardless of our age or generation, wants to be noticed and recognized and stood out. That's what I talk about, the narcissism, right? It's a chemical thing. The ways that we get it are different, or the ways we feel like we can get it are different. So my intuition would say, if we want to start getting, quote, the right people into the right positions, then start rewarding the behavior you want to see more of, okay? Because if you reward that, you'll give people the dopamine hits they need. If you want more empathy in your leadership, start rewarding empathy. Start making people stand out because they're empathetic, right? That will give them the same recognition and feelings and chemical response as maybe something else, right? And so I think we all wrap definitions around what we feel like are going to give us those hits, right? But if the world tells us something different, we will seek those other things, because we all want to be recognized, we all want to be special, and so I think that's the way we start rewarding and recognizing the behavior we want to see more of, and leaders need to do that first, and then people will start to model that, because people want to do the right thing. People want to be recognized. People want to feel special. People want to be liked, right? We're going to behave in a way that allows us to do that. Whatever the reward system is telling us to do, we'll do.
Well, and I think that it's a great point, Rich, is I don't know if you've seen our behaviors for Greencastle, But we had values, our salty values were service, adaptability, loyalty, leadership, teamwork, integrity, enthusiasm, right? But they could be interpreted and rewarded in different ways. So what we did was we took those and we turned them into the behaviors of what we wanted to see people emulate at work. And it's been transformational for us because one of them is get shit done, right? So I can turn to an employee or a peer and say, hey, look, you're doing a really good job, GSD, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. Or I can go to a poor performer and say, hey, look, you're not taking a professional growth mindset, or something like that. But that was part of the major transformation that we went through as a company. And then the other thing is just like you said, rewarding the things that you want to occur. We have another program called the Greencastle Experience Program, where we were low on, a couple certifications here and some experience there. So what we did is we created this financially backed and meritocracy kind of approach, where you want more money, you want more responsibility and more leadership. Okay, go do these things, and I'm going to reward you for it financially, leadership wise. Obviously, reward more work, but it's one of those things again that. We weren't sure exactly how it was going to go, and it's been about a year since we launched it, and it's been a success as well. And so it's that reward. In my opinion, it's clearly saying, "Hey, this is what I want from you, but I'm also willing to reward you for it." And it might be money, it might be some sort of external recognition. It might be something really simple, but you have to. That narcissism does come into play because. Like for me, I don't want to be put out there as, the global leader in consulting, and get an award like that, which I did, by the way, just so everybody's listening.
Oh my God.
Congratulations.
Did I mean, come on, I wanted Galactic, but they wouldn't give it to me. But nice. What I want is the company to be rewarded and the company to get those recognitions. And that's how I'm narcissistic is around the identity of Greencastle being recognized as this superior consulting firm to everybody else. So I totally appreciated that part of the book. It was and again, I think every time I read something there, I'm like, holy shit, like, yeah, I get it now.
Yeah. It's almost like a Pavlovian approach, right? Like the Pavlov's dog, right? If you reward, and maybe I'm oversimplifying what you'd said, but if you reward and the pats on the head or whatever, the treat and ring the bell and the treat, right? So if you start to shift the way our neural processes work, and you go, hey, rather than being focused on the self, if you start to get rewarded for what the team's accomplishments, is it something then that you can actually shift? And the reason I ask is you get really deep into the neuroscience behind it. So this isn't just a book about. It's clear that it's not a book just about like, oh, my experience as a SEAL commander, and this is what I think off the top of my head. Yeah, right. It's backed by science, which again was really interesting, fusing both the anecdotal evidence with hard science. Is that something that, and I think for people listening, they're organizational folks, leaders, they go, oh man, that sounds really hard to transform this good high performer I have into somebody who's maybe more oriented towards empathy or oriented towards a team. Is it what's the answer there? Is just the long game approach?
Yeah, I think it's a long game approach, and I think it's again, I just think it's I think you're right. It's not that complicated. Listen, I mean, if I'm a boss and I have the choice between rewarding someone who has the top sales numbers, but they kind of were an asshole doing it, and someone who doesn't have the top sales numbers, but they helped other people get better, and I say I'm going to give the bonus or whatever that is to that person. Guess what the other person's going to do? They're going to do one of two things. They're either going to change their behavior so they get reward the next time, or they're going to leave, which is with both choices are fine, right? I mean, so this is it's a very natural. This is natural. This is nature. This is we have to. So the reason why I love the neuroscience stuff is because I'm really interested in the elemental us, and I think we talked. This idea of who shows up when everything's kind of going sideways, and it comes from this really kind of innate desire to figure out, which is, you're going to laugh when I say this because you guys thought this too, to figure out when I got through Buds and there was 38 of us left after 160 or so started, and I said to myself, how the hell did I get here? I mean, I'm looking at people around me. It's like,
I was going to ask this question. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how can I compare to some of these people who seem like superheroes to me? How am I here? How did I do it? And what's interesting is all the other guys were saying the same thing. You guys were saying the same thing about all of us, right? So it's, for me, it's about taking these things that we do and going down to the atomic level, because if we go down to the atomic level to explain them and articulate them, then they're transferable and translatable across context. Now we can start using what we learned about ourselves on the beaches of Buds or in combat and helping the single parent, and helping the person who's going through cancer, and helping the student. I mean, that's what excites me. It's not about telling stories about all the stuff we did, because honestly, war is not fun anyway. So I'm not going to tell war stories, right? So it's really about explaining this stuff so other people can actually use it, and that's why the neuroscience is so important.
Well, and that's why I like a lot of the aspects of it, because it does directly relate to running a business from my point of view, and also how people can get ahead in the business world if they understand themselves a lot better. They have to. I mean, I think in order to be a successful person, you got to understand yourself, right? And back to that whole thing at Buds, if you would have lined up class 209 on the beach on day one, and there were over 200 people, and you would have said pick out the 20 or 30 that are going to make it, I would have picked out all the wrong people. And it was because I was basing it on my preconceptions of bodybuilder, triathlete, whatever. And it really came down to, in my opinion, the 90% mental, and the ability to push through and have grit and the resiliency and all that kind of stuff that you go into in the book. And it's interesting to if there was a correlation to the mixture of all those things that made one person more successful than another, right? And that's part of what your research was about. Was, all right, is there a way? Is there not a formula, but is there a recipe that makes John more successful than the guy that quit, right?
Yeah. And it's very contextual. It's funny, Joe, because I think you remember this. We started in 209 together, and we had a class leader who was a former. Well, he had been in the Army, he transferred. I'm not going to name names, but I remember he had us over to his house one time, and he was talking to all of us officers, and he looked directly at me. I don't know if you remember this. He looked directly at me and said, "Rich, I don't know if you're meant for this. I'm not sure if you'll make it." That's what he told me.
I don't remember that, but
and I remember.
I don't put it past that gentleman. That's for sure.
Yes, that's right. And of course, as we know, that didn't turn out very well for him. He quit pretty quickly. I think. Well, he kind of got injured and he hung around a little bit, but anyway, he never made it.
So John, he would always tout that he went to Ranger school. I was a Ranger, or no, that he went to Ranger school. He never elaborated on the fact that he never graduated Ranger school, and that he was there as
it's minor details. You get.
So when it comes down to these elemental behaviors, this is where attributes really show up, and this is why I got interested in them, because we can't see them right away. You can't. This guy, to his credit, he couldn't see the attributes that I had inside of me because I was just sitting in his living room. We were just having dinner with all the officers, right? We hadn't been tested yet together.
Which is a nice casual conversation to have. Hey, by the way, over dinner, and hey, pass the potatoes. By the way, you're going to fail. Yeah. Hey, would you pass the potatoes? Also, you don't have it in.
It's kind of my roommate was Kevin W., who I still talk to once in a while, if you remember, and that guy was hilarious.
Kevin was a hilarious dude.
He hated this guy. I mean, he was just funny. And I remember him saying, he was so mad. But listen, this is to anybody's credit. You can't see this stuff. It's hidden. It's hidden underneath. And this is why when you are in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, Buds is certainly one example, but any stress, challenge, and uncertainty, it's a perfect laboratory inside of which you can see this stuff bubble out. And then again, we have to remember that the attributes required to be a Navy SEAL are going to be different than the attributes required to be a great salesperson, or work at your organization, or work in it, or be a teacher. And so it's incumbent on every team and organization to figure out what are the attributes required. What does that list look like? And then once they have that list, say, okay, now, do we have enough of it on our team? Are we working to develop it if we need to? And B, what are our gaps? And if you have gaps, now you can hire for attributes versus just skill, because you can always train skill. Skill's important. You have to come with some basics, of course, but you can always train it to be better. Like we all know, you can always train someone to shoot better. You can always train someone to skydive better if they have the attributes to begin with.
Right. It's interesting. There's a couple pieces in what we've talked about, like. how maybe what Hollywood has, and we probably all told these same stories about the Division I, just unbelievable caliber athlete who dropped out after like a hot minute in the first 30 seconds of Hell Week, or even the first week of Buds, and then this fat body who made it through and just suffered enormous extra. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry. Yes. Sorry. I wasn't trying to point out anybody.
Natty All-Star, first officer inductee.
I tell people about the Goon Squad, and for those listening who don't know, in Buds there's as you're doing formation runs or something like that, there's always your lower 20% or 25%, and just to ensure that 25% isn't there, they're not at the bottom of the pack because of laziness, but just because they're maybe not as fit as the other 75%. The instructors give them extra attention. So after you do a 4-mile run or something, then the instructors pull the lower 25%, the guys who finished in the bottom part of the pack on this run, and they make them get wet and sandy. They'll make them do extra push-ups. So they beat them.
Is getting your ass beat.
Right.
And the kicker to this that a lot of people don't get, and I say it's fascinating when you look at what the human condition will endure if you have the right. And it goes into a little bit we're going to talk about with talk about drive and grit. There was a guy who he'll remain nameless, who just one of the toughest human beings I've ever met. His parents were in and out of jail, and he was in and out of foster care. There was nothing that Buds or anybody else could do to this kid that he hadn't already endured. And he was always in the bottom 25%. He was always in the Goon Squad. And this guy, not only he was kind of a fat body, wasn't a good runner. So he would run his ass off, but still be slower than everybody else, super fit. And then he would get beat on top of that. And there was just nothing that the instructors could do to break this guy. But yet we had these, high caliber athletes that were dropping out. And for me, that was the awakening for me to go, wow, it truly is that 90% mental. If you can turn off that option to quit, and it goes into sort of a good segue into, if you have the right drive and the right level of grit, or if you can find it in yourself, you can make it through anything. And I think there's a good lesson for people that run organizations. If it's a sales team, if it's a venture capital, if it's teachers that are working on the inner city, it really is a combination of a couple key attributes that determine who's going to survive.
It always is, and you're so right. And I don't know what it is that we all came to the game with, right? Whatever past experience that each one of us that actually made it through came to the game with. And I've tried to autopsy my child. I was an average student, an average athlete. My childhood was really nice. There was nothing bad. I had no trauma in my childhood. So I really tried to say, okay, what was it that made me gritty enough to have what it took to make it through? And I have some ideas, but the overarching idea is that when someone shows up, they have to have had some of that already, because you are not going to make it unless you have grit. And I think grit are the most important ones. Drive a little bit. I think when it comes to mental acuity, compartmentalization is the most important in terms of getting through Buds. But I think when you look at some of these athletes who come to Buds thinking that they're ready to go, they're making two mistakes. First of all, they're making the mistake that it's a physical thing, but they're also making the mistake because they don't understand that some of them. I don't want to besmirch athletes, because there are a lot of athletes who work very hard, but some of them have, for their whole entire lives and processes, been in a very conditioned, known and certain environment. For this is all about operating uncertainty. And I always nicknamed the SEALs masters of uncertainty, because that's what we were. We were training to be masters of uncertainty, which means when the environment goes to shit and nothing makes sense, we know how to perform, right? And it's not always pretty, by the way. It's sometimes decidedly ugly and painful, but we still do it. And that's somehow what we were used to operating in, whereas some of these kind of, and I'm going to say this, and I don't want to say it in a bad way, but prima donna-like athletes who showed up,
I totally understand.
They didn't understand it. They didn't know what it meant. And this is why I think the sport matters too, because, they've done studies, as we all know, like what are the sports that really make it? And they haven't made any definitive answers, but what they have seen is like wrestlers tend to do well. Water polo players tend to do well. I would imagine nowadays, if people are like fighters, I think combat sports are very, very applicable to that type of mentality, because it's constant adaptation, and it's constant perseverance, and it's constant grit that has to be those, because it's constantly changing.
Rich, do you think, and you're probably familiar with it, obviously, but do you think Stoicism plays into this at all? And the self-reliance, that knowing that they can get through almost anything because they've had, like, for example, for me, I knew I had been challenged and failed and succeeded and been challenged to the point where, like, I'm not sure I'm going to make it, but I always knew through, and I didn't know it at the time, but through, the kind of the philosophy of Stoicism that I'd make it through, that I could do this, and that I had, control over this much, and I couldn't control if the instructor is going to make the run 5 miles instead of 4, right? And you just do it. You just go, okay, we just passed the 2-mile mark. Let's keep going, right?
Yep.
And that's kind of how. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't know what Stoicism was back then. But I do now, and it's one of those things where I think that was, at least for me, one of the things that helped me get through it was this. All right, I can control this. And I can't control if the instructor is going to beat us, to a living pulp, on Friday evening before, Hell Week or anything like that, right?
So I totally agree. Although the only addition I'd make to that is because, again, I think Stoicism it's probably not enough to tell the story, right?
Okay.
I think compartmentalization starts to tell the story. We somehow, along our pathway, before we hit the beaches of buds, learned how to effectively compartmentalize in a way that said, okay, there's a ton around here that I can't control, and therefore I'm not going to worry about it. And out of the stuff I'm going to control, I'm going to pick one thing, and I'm going to focus on that, and then I'll move to that. And then once I get there, I'll ask the question again. Okay, this is us on the beaches of buds, and I tell the story a lot, and I'm thrilled to tell it again to people who actually can relate. Right, we're running on the beaches with the fucking boats on our head, and you're like, okay, when is this going to end? I don't know. I mean, it's just awful, right? And I remember literally thinking to myself, okay, I'm just going to focus on the end of the berm. That's what I'm going to focus on.
Right.
And we run to the end of the berm and I make it. Okay. Well, when we do that, what happens is we actually create a reward system. We get a dopamine hit because we've set a goal and accomplished it. All right. So we get a dopamine reward. Well, dopamine, as we all know, it tells you to keep going. It gives you a boost, which means you can ask the question again. And you can actually, I think we unconsciously do this all the time. And what I realize is the brilliance of the training, because it applies in combat as well. When you start getting overseas and you start getting into gnarly situations in combat, you focus in. You say, okay, a lot of shit going on. Okay, what do I need to focus on right now? What's important? I'm going to do that. And this is why, these movies where you're in combat and the guy's in combat and their buddy gets shot and is like dying, and it takes like 5 minutes while this guy's mourning his buddy during the gunfight. It's like, it doesn't happen, right? Does not happen. When that shit happens for real, you don't even have time. You have to focus on what matters. Is you have to win the gunfight, and then you mourn later. Hopefully you mourn later, right? Because you need to do that release. But I think we showed up at the beaches with elements of our past that trained us to do this, and then we just got it hyper developed in buds. We had enough to start getting us through, right? And it got hyper developed so that now we're compartmentalization masters, which is very effective. Can be detrimental, obviously. Not good in a relationship. But
unless you're a serial killer, it's perfect.
That's right. And we've seen, by the way, in the news, we've seen the negative effects of that play out with some of the negative things that we've seen SEALs in the news for. However, very effective when balanced for that type of role. Because this, by the way, can be translated a bit when you're in rough situations. It expends a lot of energy in a useless manner if you worry about things you cannot control. And you need to basically say, okay, what's out there? You ask 3 questions. Okay, what's out there that has anything to do with what I need to do, right? What's that list look like? And of that list, which is probably like that compared to that, of that list, what can I control right now? And then you say, I'm moving to that. Okay, and then you get there and you say, what's the next question? What's the next thing I can control? And that's in fact how you step through these environments. We just somewhere along the line had it in us, which is cool.
You just to be clear, and you mentioned the sort of the myth of Hollywood. In real combat, cradling somebody who's been shot in your arms, cradling them in your arms and like screaming out "no" and then saying "don't you die on me," that's real.
That is decidedly no. That is decidedly not real, right?
Yes. Don't you die on me.
Yeah, and if the guy who's dying has any cognition whatsoever, it's like, stop talking to me and get the helicopter here, right?
Yes, right.
Because I need to get some medical.
What are you talking to me for? Start fighting.
What are you talking to me for? Yeah. So So yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, Hollywood has to dramatize everything, so I get it. And I always say, I remember being on a ship. One of the deployments I did was on a ship as a L&O, and I remember a bunch of the sailors. This was right as 9/11 happened, and a bunch of the sailors wanted to talk to me about being SEALs, and so I had a group of like 10 dudes who wanted to talk to me, and I said, okay, I'm starting this talk with this comment. Nothing about doing the job of a Navy SEAL is cool. It doesn't feel cool. It doesn't feel great. When you're freezing in the ocean, it's not great. When you're rucking with weight on your back, it's not great. Marching through, nothing's cool. The cool part is afterwards, when you're having a beer and you look back and you say, "Ooh, look what we did." But there's never any cool music playing while you're in there. I mean, there's nothing about the movies. Yeah, nothing about the movies is accurate. It actually sucks. But again, part of the coolness after the fact is that you did something that sucked, right? So, but it's not cool when you're doing it, or it's cool in the wrong way. It's freezing cool, right? But it's not cool. So
I was watching another interview with you, and it's something you just brought up a second ago, kind of triggered that memories. I watched another interview with you on a different podcast, and you were comparing 2020 and what we just went through, and sort of what we still are in with buds. And you said, it sucks. It's you compared the challenge that we had to go through as a society, the stress that people dealt with. But the interesting point that was really kind of jumped it out at me is you said the only difference is in buds, if you didn't want to do it anymore, you could just ring the bell and you quit. In 2020, you didn't have that option. And that was really fascinating. So there are, I don't know, waxing philosophic, there are two ways that people could go coming out of this. And you talk about reflecting, self-reflection back on your attributes and learning about what what your attributes you said, a lot of they're innate. When you come out of 2020, you could either go, wow, I could go one of two directions, like emotional trauma from the fact that I couldn't escape that, or I could reflect on and have an awakening, like, wow, I came out of this unscathed. How do people?
And I'm stronger for it.
I'm stronger for it, right? How do you go towards the latter and not become a victim of, like, because I mean, the emotional trauma is a real thing, right? It's for everybody who has teenage girls or teenage boys, or to us as adults, right?
Yeah.
It's a real thing, right?
Yeah, and I think so. It's the difference between resiliency and anti-fragility, right? And resiliency is of course you get knocked off baseline, and how fast and rapidly can you get back to baseline? And that's very very important, because if you can't get back to the baseline, then what happens is you're below your baseline, and next time you get hit, you go further back. So the delta increases and you fall into entropy. Right. So resiliency is important, but of course we're interested in anti-fragility, which is you get knocked off baseline. When you come back, you're stronger. Your baseline has moved. That process requires a couple things. So it requires effectively moving through the stress challenge, right? And then once you've moved through it, it involves an effective recovery process. And by recovery, it means ultimately, are you able to get to a place where the emotions have distilled enough so you can look subjectively back at it? Okay, because the next phase, the growth phase, happens actually in the reflection part, right? Once you're recovered, then you reflect back and you ask empowering questions and objective questions about that event. How did I grow? What did I do wrong? Where was it my fault in an honest way? Where was it other people's fault, right? You can't necessarily ask those questions and get the right answers if you still have emotions, a lot of emotions surrounding the event, because those emotions will trigger, or the event will trigger those emotions, and we know how we answer questions when we're emotions. This is why I say if you and that time frame to get over those emotions, it varies, right? But I also say if you've been through something traumatic, and you still have emotional baggage around you, there's still triggers there, then definitely get help, because you can't necessarily do this on your own. So I'm a real huge proponent of people getting help for that, because if you can get to a place where you can look back and ask the right questions, then you are now in the growth process. Major trauma aside, all of us as human beings can do this for most of the little tragedies that happen in our lives, right? Because that's what most of our tragedies are. They're little. and we can say, okay, let me get over it. It could be the fight with the spouse. It can be the bad day at work. It can be whatever it is. Even some of our COVID experiences. My COVID experience, thankfully, wasn't that bad. I mean, I was quarantined. We were fine. There were certain parts that sucked, but I love being around the family, and so I can. My experience is something I can look back and effectively autopsy and reflect without any emotion. And most of us can kind of do that on our own if those challenges and events are able to be recovered from on our own. But I certainly want to make sure people understand if you feel like you're having trouble, then go get help, because there are tons of people out there who can help you kind of recover, and that's for a lot of soldiers too. PTSD. This is how PTSD shows up. It was when guys can't and gals can't effectively emotionally recover, and so they need help doing that, and it's important that they do. So
it sounds like, and Joe would talk a little bit what you talked about with stoicism and acknowledging what you can and can't control. It sounds like that deliberate reflection, and we often talk about, like, oh, I don't look back. I'm always looking down the field. Like, oh, that's what I do, and the inverse is true, that a pause and looking back and maybe even taking a little bit of a stoic approach to it, to reflect on that growth is actually what will help reinforce the future growth ahead.
I always use this analogy, which you guys are going to appreciate. Okay, and I'll ask you this: when we're first learning how to patrol in the teams or wherever, but certainly in the teams, our experience, right? We experiment with different positions in the patrol, right? Sometimes point man, sometimes in the middle, but sometimes all of us try out risk security. And when we're trying out risk security, and you're walking along in your patrol, and you turn, and you're supposed to always look back, right? Because you want to see the trail from there. And if you do that while walking, in other words, you're walking backwards, what did the instructor always do to us? At least my instructors kick the shit out of us. They're like, never walk backwards, right? Yeah. Never walk backwards in a patrol. When you turn, you stop, you turn around, you look, and then you turn back around, you catch up. And the reason is because you don't want to trip. If you're walking backwards, the potential for you to trip and fall and your gun goes off, whatever, is bad. So like, hey, just stop, turn around, take a look, and then walk, right? So the analogy, the lesson is, it's always good to stop and look back, okay? But you can't move forward while doing it. If you move forward while looking back, you will trip, you'll fall, your weapon go off, bad things will happen. So always look back, stop, look back once in a while so you get a sense of it, you learn your lessons, and then turn around and move forward. And I think it's a good analogy for the way we can kind of effectively look at our past.
No, I truly appreciate that, because that is, if you don't pause and take an intentional look back. We do it at work with after action reports, like we did in the military, sit there and be honest about what's going on and who did what, and without ego, without blame. And you're really asking, okay, what can we sustain, improve, and stop? It's a cathartic process as well. It helps, put some things to bed, and it helps you move forward with, the new growth. So I didn't realize that. That was a good analogy, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I'll add to that, Joe, because I think one of the things that you say, since you have a culture of that, if you have a culture of effective AARs, after action reviews, where it's done in a way that say, hey, we're going to grow. It's not about kicking people in the butt or whatever. It's about growth, right? You've basically rewarded and created a culture of accountability, because you created an environment of safety where someone who screws up says, hey. And we know this, like in the teams, it's like when you do an AR, it's usually the person who screwed up was the first person to raise their hand and say, oh, I screwed that up. This is how I did it, right? As long as it's, sometimes you have some outliers, right? But that culture allows someone to say, hey, I screwed up. I did this. Let's learn from it, right? And so effective AARs in a safe environment where it's done in that type of way will encourage an environment of accountability. And this is one of those things. You are literally rewarding accountability, which is certainly one of the attributes we want to see in any of our team members, but certainly our leaders.
I want to shift gears just for a second, because I think people maybe, I think they can relate in any organization. There was a part in the book where you talk about being in charge of the screening process to bring people from the SEAL teams into other specialized units. And you said you have some folks who are super high performers, and you talked about the one story about one individual who, and I think we all know guys just having been in the community, who were really high performers who could go on and go to that next level, or so we thought. And you being in charge of that, you had to have the hard conversations with really high performers to say you're cutting it in all of these great areas except for one or two that are critical, and you had to let them down softly. And again, people would say, "Oh, a bunch of SEALs, you can just tell them you ain't got it, and they could just take it." But that's not the way we're still wired as emotional human beings, right? And so I want to just dig into it a little bit about, like, how do you tell this super high performer, and in this case, it was the guy who was doing close quarters combat, and the way that you guys did it was very, very, very narrowly defined in terms of your wiggle room to make errors, right? And so how do you let down, for other people that are listening, how do you let down, or how do you counsel a high performer and tell him he's just not cutting it without ruining their motivation? How do you do that? Hi, Colleen.
Yeah.
Well, John, let me have a conversation with you real quick about your performance.
Yeah. Let's do it right now.
Yeah.
I mean,
how do you tell Joe to let a guy down? Yeah, asking for a friend.
It's extreme difficulty, and it's one of the things that really encouraged me to start looking at attributes, because again, to tell guys that they were bad shooters, or they couldn't do CQC right, or they're screwing up their corners, or whatever it was, it didn't make sense, because these guys were already high performers, and it made them feel like shit. And it made us feel like shit too, to be honest with you. But it also began to separate. It began to create a little bit of a stigma between that command and the rest of the spec war, in terms of just consternation. And so that's one of the things that really encouraged me to say, okay, we're looking for something different. And if I can be more transparent about some of these elemental qualities, and describe to these guys coming in, hey, this is what we're actually looking for. Again, it's a specialized unit. We're looking for very specific and specialized things. And this is what that list looked like. So when I got that list, when we ended up getting the attributes list, I used to, before the training class, I'd put it up for the training class. So they'd have it be on the auditorium. It's like, hey, we're just about to start. I'm going to give you the secret to getting through. And they'd be, you got to see the notepads come out, and I'd show them, this is what we're looking for, right? And of course, no one would write anything down, because like I don't know how to, and that's the point, right? I don't know how am I supposed to work on my honesty, or whatever it is, whatever name the attribute. But I said this is what we're looking for. I said, and when we go through the CQC course, the secret to it is that it's not about the CQC. It's about other things we're looking for. But what that allowed me to do, and us to do, and I'm not sure if it still goes on. I know we tried to do when I was there, but things change when leadership changes. I was able to then sit down with candidates who didn't make it through, and say, listen, out of all these attributes, here are some ones that you really show up remarkably with, right? These are all the things you show up remarkably. And this, by the way, translates to why you're doing so well in this facet of the SEAL teams, and why you will continue to do great. However, when it comes to this specific niche, right? And these specific attributes that we're looking for, we're just not seeing the levels that we need to see, and that's why we can't have you here. But take all this stuff, take it with you as you go out and go back to the teams, and use it, because you now know something about yourself which will make you better. And those were, and I'm not saying it didn't take the sting away. No top performer wants to hear that they didn't make it, right? But I think what it did in most cases was allow people to walk away with a little bit more empowerment versus disempowerment. And that was certainly, I certainly recognize that. I tell the story of the very last chapter of a guy who I visited after the fact, and how he said, hey, this really helped me at the end of the day. It was really professional. It was very professionally developing, and that was really really meaningful for me. So,
well, and that's a great point. So, when at Greencastle we have all veterans, right? So everybody at the office is a veteran, and when somebody's having performance issues, I always tell my team leaders and my engagement leaders and other folks that you have to decouple the behavior that you're witnessing and trying to improve from the individual, because the individual is a good guy. You might want to go have a beer with them. They're philanthropy, whatever they're doing over here. But it's that, hey, I hired you to do a specific job, and you're just not doing it, and using our behaviors, which do align a little bit with your attributes. But it's just saying, hey, look, you're not facilitating solutions or getting shit done, whatever it might be. But it has to be decoupled from that individual, because the person's not a bad person. It's the behavior, it's their whatever they're doing over on the other side that is the problem. And I think that's an effective way to, one, you can maintain that relationship afterwards, and it's not oh, you're an asshole, that kind of thing. It keeps it on that next level of professionalism and working with somebody.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And the next level down is what causes that behavior. Behaviors are influenced by attributes. They're influenced by values. I mean, those are the things that are underneath, right? And so I think you're right. When you approach someone with empathy, you can say, okay, why is this person's behavior the way it is? And start figuring out and recognizing, oh, wait a second, it's because they value this and I don't value that, but that's why they made that decision. Or their attributes are this way. I mean, they're not that patient, right? They're actually highly impatient, which is just one of the attributes. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that's why they behave the way they do, right? So you can begin to, I think it's almost a hack into some empathy, because you start understanding people at much deeper levels. And you say, wait a second, okay, I get it. If I were impatient, I'd be pissed off too, or I'd be behaving that way too. So it allows for some forgiveness if that's possible. It also allows for better placement, because sometimes it's just because we put someone in the wrong seat on the bus, right? If you put them in another seat, they're going to excel, right? But if we know what their engine looks like, we can probably find the better seat for them. And then sometimes there are the cases where they're just not a good fit for that team. But it certainly allows you to not jump to that third one before walking through those first two.
You're again shifting gears just a little bit. There's a whole chapter dedicated just to talking about humor, and we know that gallows humor is a real thing, and there's science that supports how it's a catharsis and being able to inject humor or find the lighthearted side of what are other dire circumstances. You talk about some situations in Buds. You talk about one instance where your wife sent you up to find some cotton swabs and you couldn't find the cotton swabs. And then she comes up, and and anybody who's read this knows, who has ever lived with another human being in any instance, whether it's your kids or your spouse, whatever, knows it. Like, where are they? Where are your glasses? I don't know. Like, they're on your head or something, right? And your wife says, and she comes up and she finds the cotton swabs right in front of you. And she says, and as she's walking away, she says, "No wonder you guys haven't found bin Laden." And I thought that was just it was a fantastic, what a fantastic quip to pull out. But the interesting thing I thought just in that anecdote or any of the other stories is how humor can be used to address like the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Like for her, in this situation, your wife could have been like, "Hey, I'm tired of you like telling me it's not there," and it is right there. But she used like a lighthearted sort of a dig, but something that we could all laugh at. And you dedicate a whole chapter just talking about that, not just in the SEAL teams, but elsewhere. Where have you found that to be a critical component? Where is it backfired? What do you like? What are just some general thoughts, if you can expand a little bit on that?
I have never encountered any high performing team, regardless of what discipline they're in, that hasn't had at least one or two class clowns. The guys or gals who just are the ones who crack jokes, who make people laugh when times are shitty, and again, it's not that you have to be the class clown. It's just you have to be able to laugh. One of the stories I tell.
Why do you have to be able to laugh?
Because what happens is laughter actually gives us a burst of three very powerful chemicals. When we laugh, we get a burst of two neurotransmitters and one hormone. Neurotransmitter dopamine, which we've already talked about. This feels good, keep doing it. We get endorphins, which is the human's opiate system, masks our physical pain. And then we get oxytocin, which is a hormone, but a fast working hormone that is the love hormone, right? It's a bonding chemical. So when we exchange with physical contact, acts of kindness, generosity, that induces oxytocin, right? We get all three of those when we laugh. And so the story I tell is actually when I was in the surf zone during surf torture, right? And they did the classic thing where they pull the van up and the guy gets out and he says, "Hey, we got hot chocolate, we got blankets, and we got donuts in the van. Anybody who quits?" And we all know a lot of people quit. Well, the guy next to me to my right, and Joe, we both know him. He was a tall, blonde officer, academy officer who was good with the ladies. He was just visiting me a couple weekends ago. He was the guy next to me. Oh, I know
what you're talking about.
Yeah, and he basically yells at the top of his lungs, "Hey, do you have any chocolate glazed donuts? Because if you don't have any chocolate glazed, I'm not quitting." Right? And we both burst out laughing. And I remember looking to the guy
and the scene, if I can, for people who don't know, like the scene is you are miserable. It's the middle of the night. Your arms are locked. The cold,
you're in the
cold air is blowing. You're in the you know, if people don't know, like you get soaking wet laying down the water, and then you stand up and let the air just blow over these soaking wet clothes. So I mean, there's very few more miserable situations you can think of.
No, because the waves, because when you're lying down, even the waves wash over and then they recede and the wind hits and then the waves wash over and it's awful, right? Well, he makes that joke. We both start laughing. I look to the guy to my left, and that guy's just stone-faced. He didn't even hear the joke, right? He is just lost in his pain. I remember saying to myself, I was like, "Ooh, that guy's not gonna make it," right? And sure enough, a minute later, he quit. But that's what. So what happens? This buddy of mine makes a joke, right? To my right. Immediately, I get a hit. I laugh. I get a hit of dopamine, right? This is good. Keep doing it. I get a hit of endorphins. This doesn't feel so bad. And I get a hit of oxytocin. We're in this together, right? It is a tremendously powerful hack. I think you and I, all three of us will agree. People say, do you miss the teams? I don't say I miss the teams because miss indicates like I want to be back there, and that's not possible. And even if I was, it'd be different. I look fondly back, but the parts I look fondly back the most on are the times we were laughing, like in the most miserable environments. We were laughing, and that's one of the biggest. That's one of the most important skills you learn. It's one of the most important attributes that comes out in buds, because remember, Hell Week, when we're doing the stories around the fire in Hell Week, or the instructor impressions in third phase on San Clemente Island. Those are literally laughing till we're crying. Those are the times, and it's miserable, right? You're wet and you're sandy, you're tired, you're laughing till you cry, and I tell you what, those are the times you're like, okay, I'm gonna make it. It's fine. I'm good. So it's really important. It's one of the most important things I think for any team. So, and by the way, high performing teams doesn't have to be a SEAL team. It doesn't have to be an athletic team. It's basically two or more people working together towards a common goal or objective, which means a great marriage is a high performing team. A group of friends is a high performing team. If you have a great marriage and you have humor and you mutually support each other, that's a high performing team. And that's why it's one of the reasons why, by the way, sense of humor is one of the most desired traits in finding a mate, male and female. It's just because when you can make someone else laugh, it's a signal neurologically and biologically that this person has my back and they'll help pull me through, right? That's important. That's why it's important in any relationship.
That's a good point.
The one thing you mentioned there was you said it doesn't have to be a SEAL team or a sports team. The recurring theme in there, you said, a marriage is a high performing team, and the recurring theme in there is the word team. We had Dr. What's his name, Josh Cotton, who you may have worked with.
I know Josh.
So we had Josh on, and he obviously did a lot of studies, not just on the SEAL teams, but he's an organizational psychologist. And he says, and it was fascinating because I've never looked at our community, the SEAL team community, or other communities that do the same thing. He said one of the things when they were studying about what makes SEALs, like what makes you either get through buds and then go on to become successful in the teams. And since the beginning of time, like psychologists have come through, the Navy has hired and spent endless amounts of money trying to figure it out. And one of the things that Josh brought up that I hadn't heard before was, he says, when you guys refer to your time in that community, you say, when I was in the teams. He says, and everything you say is about the teams. It's not I, or when I was part of this group, or when I was over there with this gaggle of folks. It's everything is the teams. He's like, that's so ingrained, that team mindset. He said that's one of the indicators that we believe is something that will determine whether you will be successful or not, is that you're a high performer, and you maybe a little bit of narcissism. You want to perform just because your ego or you're driven to it, whatever. But there's also it's belied by this concern about your contribution to the team. And I think you addressed that a little bit in the book.
Well, it's ingrained in our system, and this is. I'm not sure it might be unique to us, but I mean, just remember, what are the two fundamental rules of buds that if you break, it's like sacrosanct, and you'll get your ass beaten. What are they? They are always be running, and never leave your swim buddy. Right? Those are the two rules, right? And so it's ingrained in you to always be with someone else, right? At least one other person, right? And so So you just brought up in this environment that you're always in a team. You're forced to work with other people constantly, and this is why you see SEALs, especially in comparison to maybe some other units. And this is not good or bad. It's just an observation where we are extremely good team builders. You know, if a single SEAL goes into an embassy or some group of people that are the first thing that guy will do will begin to build a team. That's what they would just collect people. Oh, you. Yeah, there are other units, and again, no judgment here because their selection processes are different, but their selection processes are individual, right? So they're basically the individual working through wickets or whatever. And those guys are different. I mean, they can go into these groups and they can kind of work on their own. They can be a little bit more introverted, and there's nothing wrong with it. They're actually super performers on their own, but their tendency is not to build teams, whereas the team guys' tendency is to build teams. You know, there's a pro and con to both of those, by the way, right? Because because we used to say if you can't operate by yourself, that's a bad thing too, right? There are some team guys who, if they don't have their swim buddy, they're a mess, right? That's not that good. However, it is ingrained, and it's because of this idea that we're always on team. So we never, I mean, to leave your swim buddy was like one of the worst sins imaginable in
and you can't carry the boat by yourself, so
can't do anything. You can't find your way to the target underwater. You can't carry nothing. There's nothing as a sniper. You need another. It's always pairs, right? There's always someone else. So
that's a good point.
Yeah. Interesting look at it. Hey, we just want to Josh or Joe. I'm good, man. It's sorry, Josh Cotton's on my brain.
Josh is on our mind. Yeah.
Shout out to you, Josh.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're gonna have a conversation here. Come on, man.
Yeah.
No. So I'm good too, Rich. I really appreciate you coming on. When you are in Philly, you got to stop by the office. We can do, maybe a lunch and learn in front of the whole team, because I really think these attributes in the application of them, which is a lot tougher than just reading the book, and reading's hard for me. So believe me, I know what I'm saying. But I would love to have you talk to the team and talk to the company about this kind of stuff. But really appreciate it. Shouldn't have let it go 20 years in between catching up. But I really appreciate it, and it's good to see you and good to talk to you.
Hey, Rich, real quick, where can folks find you on the interweb?
theattributes.com is the best place. And there you can get the book, you can get the assessment tools, which are free. And on there, I have some workbooks on there people can download. They can, they're basically guides on how to develop each attribute, which I was getting a lot of questions on. And then there's links to my Instagram and LinkedIn and all that. But I want to tell both of you, this has been really fun to have two team guys. You know, Joe and I, we had some conversation before. I know we hit record, but Joe and I going through training together, at least 2 weeks of it, but mostly we were, training together. And then John, you were a little bit after us, but our paths were kind of tangential, I think.
I was your Hooyah class. If you guys were,
that's right. Yeah,
I was the one just checking in, going, they made it through.
And it's just so great to have a conversation with a couple of good friends and brothers. And even though we haven't seen each other, that's how I consider you both. So anything you need, just hit me up, and we'll definitely keep in touch. And I will definitely stop by if I'm in Philly. So
sounds
perfect.
Good.
The book is The Attributes, theattributes.com. Rich Diviney, thanks very much for joining us, man. We appreciate it, and we're looking forward to having you up at our place. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Greencastle Podcast. Please be sure to give us a like, a thumbs up, a share. You can find us at greencastleconsulting.com/podcast or on all the major podcast channels and the social media channels, including our YouTube channel. Thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode.